Something I have noticed about myself as I have grown older, into my mid-50s at least, is that I don't care about professional sports as much as I used to. That may have more to do with the fact that Chicago hasn't had a really good sports team in quite a while, and I grew up in Chicago, so I grew up with this nearly hereditary affection for the Bears and the Bulls and the Cubs, and never really got into the Blackhawks too much, but I knew they were there. And when they were good, I watched. But over the years, I have been exposed to some discussions of the GOAT. And the GOAT is the greatest of all time. It's an acronym for that professional athlete that is thought by most people to have been the singular, most accomplished or most impressive athlete in their particular sport. It was Michael Jordan, by the way, if you're not too sure about that. But I've been involved in some discussions about whether it was Michael Jordan or LeBron or Kobe Bryant or someone from a previous generation. Larry Bird. You know, some people say, no, Larry Bird was... And go back even further, I think maybe Bill Russell. People argue about these things. You know, who was the greatest of all time? Football, for me, it was Walter Payton, you know, because I grew up as a yes. I got an amen over here, at least a nonverbal one. But, you know, people argue about these things. Who was the greatest of all time? I've never really been involved in a discussion that I remember anyway about whether I was the greatest at anything or not, but I've detected a little bit of that in me sometimes. Occasionally, you know, when someone talks about what a good sermon someone else preached, there's something down inside me that kind of flinches a little bit. I'm like, well, that can't be, you know. But I think most of us probably recognize that there's a little bit of tension within us about wanting to be good at whatever it is that we do. And sometimes when we're in a conversation and someone talks about what we do, but they're talking about someone else who did it and they did a really good job at it, we're like, yeah, but what about all the ones that I did? Kind of a thing. There's some of that in us, that desire to be recognized as great. It's not necessarily a bad thing to want to be good at what you do, and I don't think it's necessarily bad to appreciate it when someone recognizes that you've done well in what you did. It's a part of the development of our confidence in ourselves, and when we're confident in ourselves, then sometimes we will try to do things. It's kind of a foundation for our desire to do things we're not comfortable with, our ability that maybe we can, and maybe we'll find out that we're good at something. And I just know from the perspective of a parent, it feels really good when you see your kids being good at something too, because you just know that that's healthy. It's good to discover that you're capable. And it kind of stimulates your desire to try and to explore and to do more. So I would never stand up and say that it's bad for us to want to be good at something, or it's necessarily even bad to appreciate it when we're recognized for being good at what we do. And I don't know whether it was coincidence or providence, but we almost got into the parallel passage in Mark this morning, and we opened up to Mark chapter 10, and I was like, ooh, I'm going to preach on Mark chapter 10 this morning, but I'm not. I'm preaching on the parallel, but same thing, we find it in Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 and 6, where Jesus' disciples are kind of consumed about this idea of who is the greatest. Now in Mark chapter 10, which is where we were this morning, it's verses 35 through 45, where they kind of discuss wanting to be on his right hand and his left, and Jesus talks about what true greatness is. But over in Matthew, it's Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 and 26. And we'll read a little bit more than that. We'll start reading in verse 20. Matthew chapter 20 and verse 20, where Jesus' disciples are wondering about the greatest. They're kind of having a goat discussion. You know, who's going to be the greatest? But their concern is who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And in Matthew chapter 20, you know how I talked about parents want their kids to experience being good at something or being recognized? It's Zebedee's sons, the mother of Zebedee's sons. And she comes, and it says that she kneels down in front of Jesus, and he asks something from him. And he said to her, "What do you wish?" And she said, "Grant that these two sons of mine may sit one on your right hand and one on the other, on the left, in your kingdom." What she's asking is for her sons to be recognized as his right hand and his left hand men. And I would imagine that she probably sees this as a mark of great respect to come to Jesus and acknowledge that he is going to come into his kingdom, that he is going to sit on the throne, that she probably feels like she's being very respectful to say, "My king, when you are seated on your throne, could you please remember my sons who have served you so loyally, and seat one on your right hand and seat one on your left hand?" And she probably doesn't feel like she's doing anything inappropriate or ill-conceived, but Jesus, and I can just imagine, Jesus sometimes when his disciples said the things that they said, or when he overheard his disciples arguing about who was going to be greatest in the kingdom, that he probably hurt for them a little bit. And I think some of his frustration was for the ways in which they would hurt themselves in their own ignorance with the things that they would expect and the things that they would ask and the things that they would do. And I would tie this back to Vernon's story about his coworker, his friend who spent his life agonizing about eating that slice of bologna that he knew was his mother's slice when it was such a rare thing for them to have. And knowing that God loves us and is protective of us, and if anything pains God, I would say it's got to be the pain of seeing us do and say things that are so ignorant and short-sighted and foolish, and knowing that we will remember it and probably agonize over that. When his disciples obsessed over who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom, Jesus knew that they would eventually see that through the lens of watching him condemned and beaten and humiliated and crucified. And they would see it through the lens of watching their sinless Savior in agony hang there and suffocate and bleed. And I can just imagine Jesus when conversations like this happened. I can see him thinking, "You just don't know what you're asking. And the fact that you asked this is going to hurt you someday. Because you're going to reflect back on the asking and realize that you were being so petty and so superficial and so childish after having witnessed me hang on the cross and die for you." Jesus answered and said in verse 22, "You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink, and to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" And of course, they had no idea what he was talking about. And they said, "We are able." That what they were thinking about was sitting next to him as he sat on the throne. Yeah, we can We can definitely get our minds around that. And so he said to them, you will indeed drink my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but to sit on my right hand and on my left, it is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it is prepared by my Father. And when the 10 heard it, they were greatly displeased with the 2 brothers. And I think that that was appropriate, that they were displeased by that. But Jesus called them to himself. He tries to teach them. He tries to open their eyes a little bit here. He called them to himself and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great, they exercise authority over them. He said, you guys have a picture of the kingdom that is a worldly picture of the kingdom. You think that there is just nothing but privilege associated with sitting at my right hand and my left. But the kingdom of heaven is not this way. In the kingdom of heaven, greatness is not going to be ascribed to those who sit at the right hand and at the left hand of the king. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him become your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And I would imagine that it was likely time that had to pass, and experience that they had to gain, and things that they had to witness, and fear that they had to confront before they really began to grasp what Jesus was talking about here. But he gives them a foundation. He gives them a framework with which to build a godly perspective on greatness. Who's going to be great? Who's going to be great is who God recognizes as great. And who does God recognize as great? God recognizes as great those who diminish themselves and elevate others. Those who step back and allow others to get the last of the thing that's being handed out. Those who are great from God's perspective are those who focus their abilities, their time, their energy on making other people's lives better and helping other people in whatever way they can and showing people what it is to be a disciple of Christ rather than simply speaking about it. Those are the ones that God recognizes as the great. This idea that the servant does not come to be served, but to serve. We find it in places like John 13, verses 12 through 17. When Jesus had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, this is John 13 and verse 12, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? And they were probably like, yeah, you just washed our feet. That wasn't his point. His point was what it meant. You call me teacher and Lord. This is John 13 and verse 13. And you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you should do as I have done. And most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who sent greater than he who sent him. He who is sent greater than he who sent him. And if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Romans chapter 8 and verse 29, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Those whom he foreknew, he predestined. This is predestination, that God envisioned people seeing the example of Christ and following the example of Christ, so that in that very real, not figurative way, in that very real way, Jesus would be the firstborn among many brethren. That Jesus would be the one who demonstrated with his sacrifice on the cross discipleship and greatness. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, that is a hard standard for us to follow. It is not instinctive for us to desire to sacrifice ourselves in that way. And I am grateful that God does not require of us what he asked of his Son, but that instead God says, live as a sacrifice. Be a living sacrifice. Take your lives and give them. Here, Lord, I give myself away. 'Tis all that I can do. From the song this morning, drops of grief can ne'er repay the debt of love I owe. Here, Lord, I give myself away. That's all that I can do. That is what God asks, but it's what we can do. What God asks of us can be done. God does not ask me to hang on a tree, to suffer and die. God does not require of me that I live sinlessly in order to be pleasing to him. That was the burden that Christ bore. Life lived sinlessly, innocent and sinless blood shed. And he took that so that I could live. And so that I could live in grace, so that I could live developing and growing and learning and becoming more of what God is in my character over the days of my life, so that I could learn to enjoy the value and the goodness and the satisfaction of being a servant of others. I am grateful that that's the way God set it up for me. So very quickly, as we look at the greatest of all time, we notice that from God's perspective, the greatest is not the one who seeks out the recognition or accomplishes the most things or is regarded by our culture to be great or sits on the shiniest throne or has the most of something. The greatest is a servant. And what we notice about servants is that they don't do it by accident. They do it by intent. They are intentionally available. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, Paul writes to Timothy, and Paul is writing to Timothy to encourage a man who has suffered some discouragement. He's grown frustrated with the opposition that he has faced. And he has likely written to Paul or communicated in some way with him that he's dealing with difficult people. And he's dealing with people who are resisting his authority and are resisting his teaching. And I imagine Timothy expressing this frustration to Paul. And Paul, throughout his writings to Timothy, is encouraging him to remember what a blessing it is to be tasked with the work that he's been given to do. And he reminds him, you're a soldier, Timothy. And soldiers do not go out into the world and entangle themselves in all kinds of social things. They're very task-oriented. They're very focused on what they've been given to do. And he says, no soldier, no one who is engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. And what he's saying to Timothy is, remember your priorities. He's not saying, Timothy, you can't have friends. He's not saying you can't enjoy a meal. He's not saying there can be no joy or pleasure in your life whatsoever. He's saying, remember your focus. And don't get so busy with or concerned with things that don't help you as a soldier that you're no longer a good soldier. Good military leaders realize that soldiers are people who are singularly focused on being good soldiers. And he uses that here to encourage Timothy. Stop worrying about the things that don't matter so much. Of course you're going to deal with difficult people. Of course there's going to be persecution. Be encouraged by the fact that I have faced persecution. Be encouraged by the fact that I regard it as a blessing to be counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ, and have that heart and that attitude. That's the encouragement that he gives to Timothy. You stay focused. You be available. God's not saying to us, you can't have a family. He's not saying to us, you can't have a career. He's not saying to us, you can't enjoy any of the fruits of your labor. It's good to be satisfied. It's good to enjoy a meal. It's good to lay down and rest at night and be tired because of the work of the day. Those are good things. God offers those things to us. But greatness is for those who remember that there's some soldiering to do. That these things that we can enjoy in our lives are not our purpose. It's not what God created us for. And in American culture, it is very easy for us to forget that. Among Christians who grow up in this time and in this place, it can be very easy to forget that. Our best work, our important work, our great work is the work of sharing the truth of the gospel with people who live in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. In both the things that we say and in the things that we do, which means that we have to put some thought into this. And we have to be careful that we do not get so tied up with enjoying the social aspects or the components of the privilege of being a citizen of the United States of America that we forget the work that God has given us to do, that we forget to be servants. Servants are available not by accident to serve. They're not there when someone needs them because they are accidentally there. I mean, I guess that possibly happens sometimes, that you just happen to be in the right place at the right time to help somebody. But people who are really dedicated to service, they make time to be available. They are intentionally available. John chapter 4 and verse 35. Do you not say there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. The servant is not the person who says, well, nobody really cares. No one wants to hear the truth. There's nobody out there who's interested in what I'm trying to say about how good it is to be a child of God. Yes, there are. There are people out there who are lost and lonely and looking. They are looking. And if you make it known in whatever way that you can that you're a child of God, that you love being a child of God, that it's good to be a child of God, you'll find the people who are looking for what you have. You'll find them. But you won't find them if you don't look. You won't find them if you deny that they are there. You won't find them if you go through life with your head down, hoping nobody notices that you believe the things that you believe. You won't find them. If you go through life demonstrating the character of Christ in the way you live and the way you talk, it goes into much more than that. The choices that you make and the way you spend your money and your priorities as they are evident to the casual observer. if you go through your life dedicated to demonstrate the character of God to people in the world around you, there are people who will see it and they will react badly to it. There's no doubt of that. But we can't be cowards. People are lost as a result of our cowardice. The people who are looking for you. The people who need the answers that you have. The greatest of all time is a servant who intentionally is available to serve and who looks for opportunities to share and to serve. The greatest of all time is someone who elevates others above themselves. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, Paul writes, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit." How many times I have read that verse and thought to myself, okay, what comes next? But that verse is hard. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit. It's hard for me to do that. All of my actions have to be run through this filter. Why am I doing this? Do you know that it's possible to do good things for bad reasons? Do you know that it's possible to look for opportunities to serve because you're seeking the recognition that may or may not come as a result of having done someone nice for someone else? Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. And let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also the interest of others. And let this mind be in you. The way that is worded is interesting to me. Let this mind be in you. Almost as if we will make room within ourselves for Christ's heart and Christ's perspective. If we'll make room in ourselves for it, it'll thrive there. Like we have to cultivate that, make space for it, and allow it room within us to grow, empty ourselves of ourselves a bit, and let this mind be in us, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but humbled himself, even to the death, the point of the death on the cross. That's what Jesus did with this mind. And so, the greatest of all time, from God's perspective, is not someone who scores the most points or wins the most championships or is universally, culturally recognized as the greatest of all time. From God's perspective, the greatest is a servant, is someone who is intentionally available, who looks for opportunities, and who elevates other people above themselves.